Welcome to Conspiracist. Today we are undertaking a deep dive into a persistent hypothesis that governments worldwide have intentionally concealed evidence pertaining to the alien abduction phenomena.
Yes.
We've gathered quite a collection of historical accounts, research findings from various fields, and the recurring theories surrounding this really complex subject.
It is complex.
Our mission in this deep dive is to maintain a strictly professional and objective stance as we evaluate the evidence and the reasoning that underpins these claims of a governmental cover-up.
It's a compelling hypothesis, definitely. And when you look into the history, you really see how this idea of concealment has sort of evolved alongside the abduction narratives themselves.
Right.
While the term alien abduction really took off in the 1960s, there are these older stories, sometimes called paleo abductions, which people have looked back on and interpreted as, possible earlier instances.
Like Colonel H.G. Shaw's report from 1896 in California. He claimed harassment by these tall, slender humanoids.
Exactly. And then jump forward to 1953, you've got an article in Man to Man magazine asking point blank if flying saucers were kidnapping humans.
Kidnapping them for what, though?
Well, the article speculated about things like zoological study or even vivisection. Pretty stark ideas even back then.
Yeah, stark is the word. These early mentions, they're quite striking, aren't they?
They are, and they kind of reveal this foundational anxiety about unexplained things in the sky and how they might interact with us. And this thread continues, like the 1955 report by Harold T. Wilkins about Carl Hunrath and Wilbur Wilkinson just disappearing.
Right, the mystery surrounding them.
Yes, and while it wasn't proven, there was speculation connecting their vanishing to possible abduction linked to flying saucers. So the idea was bubbling up even before the big famous cases.
Okay, so then we get to what many consider a real turning point, 1961.
Yes. The first abduction case in the U.S. really hit the public consciousness, according to sources like the McGill Office for Science and Society.
We're talking about the Betty and Barney Hill case, of course, New Hampshire.
That's the one. An interracial couple. Betty was a social worker. Barney worked for the post office. Their trip back from Canada. Well, it took a very strange detour.
They reported being chased, essentially, by an unusual light.
Pursued, yes. They stopped the car, observed what they thought was a flying saucer, even saw figures inside through binoculars.
And
then, the famous missing time. They arrived home hours later than they should have, with odd physical traces, scuffed shoes, Betty's dress was torn, and this significant gap in their memory. Total blank for a period.
That amnesia and the anxiety it caused, that's what led them to hypnosis, right? With Dr. Benjamin Simon.
Exactly. That's where the detailed narrative emerged.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Under hypnosis, they described being taken onto a craft, physical examinations. The beings they described were sort of gray-like figures.
Yes. That classic description started to solidify there. And Betty recalled being shown a star map.
The star map. That's become a huge focal point, hasn't it?
It has. Because later on, some researchers, Marjorie Fish notably, suggested it correlated with the Zeta Reticuli star system.
And the argument is that this star system wasn't widely known then.
That's the claim proponents make, that Betty couldn't have just known it. So it's presented as potential evidence. Of course, that interpretation is heavily debated.
Sure, but you could see how this one case, the Hills, it really laid down the tracks for the whole phenomenon in the public mind. Missing time, the examination, the look of the aliens. It became a kind of template.
It certainly became the archetype. But it's also relevant, as you pointed out earlier, that reports were circulating even before the Hills became famous. A 1965 piece in Flying Saucer Review mentioned abduction-like experiences, predating the widespread attention on the Hills.
So it wasn't totally out of the blue, even if the Hills case crystallized it.
Precisely. It suggests the phenomenon, or at least reports of it, might have been developing independently.
Okay, so as more stories came out, researchers started trying to, categorize things, find common threads. CUFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, they have a working definition.
They do. Essentially, an abductee is someone taken against their will by apparent non-humans to, somewhere else, a craft or another location. They're examined or communicated with, maybe telepathically, and the memory might be conscious or come back through hypnosis.
That covers the basics. And then you have folklorist Thomas E. Bullard's work. He looked at, 300 reports?
Around that, yes, a significant sample. And he identified a kind of sequence, a common narrative structure.
What did that look like?
Typically, Capture, then an examination, sometimes a conference or communication phase, maybe a tour of the craft, though he noted those were less common and possibly confabulated.
Confabulated meaning, essentially, filled in later, maybe unintentionally.
Potentially, yes, mixed with imagination or other influences. Then, the loss of time we mentioned, the return, and often what Bullard called a theophany.
Theophany, like a divine manifestation.
Sort of. A profound, perhaps spiritual or deeply significant experience connected to the event. Not necessarily religious, but powerful. And finally, the aftermath, psychological effects, physical marks, social impacts.
Interesting, though you said the conference, tour, journey, theophany, those were less consistent.
Bullard found them less frequent in the reports he studied, usually popping up between the examination and the return.
Let's focus on the more common bits then. Capture. How's that usually described?
Often involves being immobilized, unable to resist, like a paralysis, then being transported, sometimes levitating, sometimes feeling like they're passing through walls or windows, or maybe drawn up in a beam of light.
Very strange methods of transport. And the inability to fight back is key.
Very much so. Then the examination, what's the focus there?
Frequently, it seems to be on sex and reproductive biology. Also the head, nervous system, skin, joints.
It's noted that things we'd expect in a human medical exam are often missing in these accounts. No gloves sometimes, no tongue depressors, no pills, no IV drips.
And the examiners themselves.
Often described as taller than humans, maybe a different species altogether, reinforcing that sense of otherness, of the unknown.
There's also the child presentation element that comes up.
Yes, where abductees report being shown hybrid children, part human, part abductor.
But Bullard suggested this was maybe a later addition to the narrative, popularized by researchers like Hopkins and Jacobs.
His analysis indicated it wasn't as prominent in the earlier accounts he studied, yeah. Which raises questions about how these narratives might evolve or be influenced over time.
That's a really important point, how narratives can shift. We see echoes of these themes even today, right? Like accounts shared online.
Absolutely. You find descriptions on places like Reddit that resonate. Someone describing waking up, ringing ears, nausea, the room shaking, feeling like they're moving incredibly fast.
Finding themselves somewhere unfamiliar, strange lights, smells.
Exactly. Feelings of being restrained, burning sensations, maybe a figure applying some substance, another holding their hair, then finding strange marks later, like pinpricks, feeling sick, weak, smelling odd chemicals.
While these are individual stories, you can definitely see the overlap with the patterns Bullard identified.
You can. Which naturally leaves researchers down the path of exploring the psychology behind these experiences.
Right. Are there psychological factors that might predispose someone to interpret an event this way?
Well, research has looked into that. Some studies, like one from 1997, suggested a possible link between belief in UFOs and schizotypy.
Schizotypy. That's not schizophrenia, right? It's more about unusual perceptions or beliefs.
Correct. A tendency towards them, not necessarily a clinical diagnosis. Then, a 2008 study found that people reporting abductions scored higher on measures of dissociativity and tendency to hallucinate compared to controls.
Dissociativity, like feeling detached from reality sometimes.
Yes, or experiencing disruptions in memory or identity. These findings suggest psychological factors could play a role in how these experiences are perceived and reported.
And what about the fantasy-prone personality idea?
That's another significant area. It describes people with very rich, immersive fantasy lives who might sometimes struggle to distinguish fantasy from reality.
And studies have linked this to abduction reports.
A 1991 study found that a large percentage of the abductees they looked at showed traits consistent with fantasy proneness. And a later study, 2001, links richer fantasy lives with reporting UFO sightings in general.
So it raises the question of how much internal imagination might be shaping these narratives.
It definitely does, and tied into that is the whole issue of hypnosis.
Because many detailed memories only emerge under hypnosis.
Exactly, and hypnosis is known to be susceptible to creating false memories. People can become very convinced of things that didn't actually happen.
False memory syndrome.
Yes. Plus the idea of screen memories, where maybe the mind substitutes a bizarre abduction narrative for a different, perhaps more mundane, but still traumatic or confusing experience.
It's also been pointed out, hasn't it, that some recovered memories of alien abduction sound similar to memories recovered during the Satanic Panic.
That similarity is striking to many researchers. It makes you wonder about the influence of cultural fears and maybe suggestive therapeutic techniques on what kinds of memories emerge.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, what about the sociological angle? How society views this?
Political scientist Michael Barkin talked about this. He saw links between sometimes radical politics and UFO conspiracy theories. He framed them as stigmatized knowledge narratives.
Meaning, like, knowledge that the mainstream rejects, but believers feel is suppressed truth, often involving government cover-ups.
Precisely that idea, that powerful institutions are hiding something crucial.
Have sociologists looked at who tends to believe or report these things?
Yeah, there's research suggesting, for instance, that more religious individuals might be less likely to report abductions. Conversely, people with higher levels of distrust in government seem more inclined to believe in UFO cover-ups and potentially abductions as part of that.
Distrust in government. Any links to specific eras?
Sociologist Joseph O. Baker suggested a possible correlation with the general rise in governmental distrust in the U.S., particularly, say, post-Watergate.
Interesting. Now, Bud Hopkins, a big name in abduction research, did a survey back in the 90s.
He did. And his findings suggested that a noticeable percentage of the general population reported experiencing certain isolated things that often feature in abduction accounts.
Like what kind of things?
Waking up paralyzed with a sense of presence, periods of lost time, feeling like they were flying, seeing strange lights, finding odd scars that they couldn't explain.
But experiencing one of those doesn't automatically mean abduction, right? There are other explanations.
Absolutely crucial point. You have to consider known phenomena, like sleep paralysis.
Right. Waking up, can't move, maybe seeing or hearing frightening things, hallucinations.
Exactly. Shadowy figures, buzzing sounds, flashing lights. It can be terrifying. And it affects a fair chunk of the population. Maybe 15% experience it at some point.
So it's plausible some bedroom visitations or paralysis experiences linked to abductions could actually be sleep paralysis episodes.
It's considered a strong potential explanation for at least some subset of these reports, yes.
Any other alternative hypotheses?
Another one involved distorted memories of actual medical procedures, especially those done under anesthesia.
How would that work?
The groggy, disoriented state coming out of anesthesia, combined with the anxiety of surgery, could maybe lead to fragmented, bizarre recollections later on, especially if the timing lines up a reported abduction happening around the same time as a hospital stay.
Okay. So, bringing in the skeptics more formally, what are their main lines of argument?
Publications like Skeptic Magazine often focus on things we've touched on, false memory syndrome, how suggestible people can be, especially under hypnosis, and the simple misinterpretation of mundane events or psychological experiences.
They encourage looking for the simplest explanation first.
Essentially, yes, applying Occam's razor. They also point to specific cases that seem problematic.
Like the Villas Boas case.
Yeah.
Brazil, 1957, right before the hills.
That's the one. A young farmer claimed an elaborate abduction and sexual encounter. Skeptics highlight inconsistencies in his story and the fact that he'd apparently been reading science fiction with similar themes.
Raises questions about influence.
Yeah.
What about Travis Walton? That's a famous one.
Very famous. The logger, supposedly taken by a UFO in Arizona in 1975, widely seen as a hoax by many skeptics.
Why a hoax? What's the reasoning?
Well, motives are suggested, like the logging crew he was with was behind schedule and faced penalties. Taking time off for a UFO incident might have helped avoid that. Plus, details like the crew's initial calm reactions and later findings about some members having histories of dishonesty.
So, red flags for skeptics. These cases highlight the need for really careful investigation.
Absolutely. And beyond specific cases, there are cognitive factors. Biases in how we think.
Like seeing faces in clouds.
That's pareidolia, yeah. Seeing patterns and randomness. And then there's epiphania, the tendency to find meaningful connections between unrelated things.
So, someone might see a strange light, remember a weird dream, find an odd bruise, and connect them into an abduction narrative because they're primed to look for that kind of conspiracy or pattern.
That's the idea. Our brains are pattern-matching machines. Sometimes maybe too good at it.
Okay, finally, let's consider the role of belief itself. Why might someone want to identify as an abductee?
For some, it might offer a kind of quasi-spiritual meaning or a framework to understand unusual personal experiences. It can provide a sense of purpose or specialness.
There's also this concept of improvisational millenarism, linking UFOs to end times or societal transformation.
Yes, where UFOs and aliens become part of these larger narratives about humanity's future, sometimes apocalyptic, sometimes about intervention or a great change.
And culture seems to play a role, too. Abduction reports aren't the same everywhere.
Apparently not. Research suggests terror abductions, frightening, invasive experiences are reported more often in the USA, whereas in some other places, encounter narratives might be more neutral or even benevolent.
That's fascinating. It suggests cultural filters are definitely at play.
It does, and it connects to maybe even deeper historical roots. Jacques Vallée's work is interesting here.
He connected UFOs and aliens to fairies,
Yeah.
old folklore.
He explored the parallels, yes, between modern alien encounters and traditional beliefs about fairies, elves, jinn, that sort of thing.
What kind of parallels?
Things like reported invisibility, shape-shifting, taking people away, changelings, living underground or in other realms, not liking to be seen, causing memory loss or missing time. The similarities can be quite striking.
So Valley's idea wasn't necessarily that aliens are fairies, but that maybe we're dealing with a similar underlying phenomenon interpreted through different cultural lenses over time, or perhaps something extra-dimensional or non-physical.
That's one interpretation of his work, yes. That the phenomenon itself might be stranger and more complex than just nuts and bolts spacecraft from other planets, and our interpretation shifts with our cultural understanding from folklore creatures to technological aliens.
That really broadens the perspective.
Yeah.
It makes you question how much is the experience itself and how much is our framework for understanding it.
It forces us to consider the interplay between perception, culture, psychology, and potentially genuinely anomalous events. Are abductions a modern tech myth or something truly external?
A fundamental question indeed, with huge implications.
And one that, frankly, demands ongoing critical thinking and objective investigation, whatever conclusions one might lean towards.
So we've journeyed through quite a bit today. Historical accounts stretching back further than many realize, common themes in the narratives, the psychological and sociological angles, skeptical counterarguments, and the profound role of belief and interpretation.
Yeah, the reported experiences are often incredibly vivid, deeply affecting for the individuals involved.
Absolutely. Yet, as we discussed, there are these alternative explanations rooted in psychology, physiology, even cultural history that offer potential ways to understand these claims without necessarily invoking extraterrestrials or government conspiracies.
Frameworks that need to be considered seriously.
Which brings us to the question for you, our listeners. Considering all this diverse evidence, the conflicting interpretations, the personal accounts versus the scientific hypotheses, what conclusions do you draw about the nature and reality of the alien abduction phenomenon?
And stepping back to our initial focus, what might the implications be if such events were truly occurring? And if evidence was being deliberately concealed by governments, what would that mean?
Some serious food for thought. Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.